Good evening, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining, and also thanks for your patience. We always like to wait a few minutes before we start the presentation. Sometimes people have to update their Zoom and everything, so we'd like to give everybody a chance to join. My name is Kimo Paula. I'm from Relo, and today I will be your host and we'll be sharing more information about letting your home in Amsterdam. Maybe some household remarks before we start. The content of this presentation will be first the presentation itself, and at the end there will be room for a Q&A. Please, if you have any questions during the presentation, put them in the Q&A. You can find them on the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on where you have the controls. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll answer all the questions that you've asked. Again, the content of this presentation will be in several steps. We're going to talk a little bit more about deciding to rent and what to know before you start. We're going to talk a little bit more about your bank and mortgage, of course, the rental contracts, tenancy checks, and maintenance and repairs. It's going to be maybe a 20-25-minute presentation, and afterwards there'll be room for Q&A. Again, put your questions in the Q&A section, and I'll be answering them at the end of the presentation. But first, before you decide to rent a property, what's good to actually think about? What is good to take into account? Of course, the first one is calculating your ROI, because you're not renting out your property for nothing. You're not doing it for a charity, so it's good to figure out what you'll be earning in the end. There's a few things that are worth considering. On the next slide, we'll share a calculation, example calculation. But one of the things you need to think about, of course, is your mortgage fees, your mortgage costs, the VVE or the owner association fees that you'll be paying if you own the property, maintenance, furniture and fixtures, and also taxes. By the way, one of the things I forgot to mention earlier on is that this webinar will be recorded. We'll share it with you after the webinar, and of course the presentation will be shared with you as well, so no need to write everything down. Then once you've actually decided, okay, I think I can actually at least break even or earn some money on renting my property, then it's good to decide how are you going to rent it out. Are you going to rent it out furnished or unfurnished? What's good to know is if you rent it out furnished, you can kind of like top the rental price up by about 10%. If you rent it out unfurnished, lower it by about 10%. That's the upside to renting it furnished. If you rent it furnished, then the downside is you'll have maintenance, and after a year or 2 years, you have to replace the furniture, depending, of course, how much the tenants have lived in the property. Then, okay, you know your ROI is, the furnished or unfurnished is also taken care of. What's your rental price going to be? There's a few things worth looking into. Where is your property located? What's the size? What are the bedrooms and level of finishing? There are several property websites or listings out there. One is called Perarius. The other one is, of course, called Fonda. Have a look at them if you're interested to see what is on rent in the location that you're having a property in. We offer a free rent estimate as well, so just jump on the website, relo.nl, and click on the button, get your free rent estimate, and we'll be able to share comparable properties with you as well. Okay, here's an example of calculating your ROI. We've based it on an actual property that we're renting out for 1,750 euros per month. What is good to know is that this rental price is for a furnished property. If it would be unfurnished, you would be able to charge a little bit less for it, about 10% less. Okay, so then we've got the income, that's 1,750. Then we have the mortgage. What is good to know is that you have to calculate the gross mortgage. So at the end of the year, or maybe you've already have your tax benefits deducted on a monthly basis, but that is the net cost for the mortgage. The gross cost of a mortgage is something that you have to take into account. We'll get into that a little bit later. The VVE fees, of course, for this property, it's about 80 euros per month. Then you have maintenance. We always like to take about 5%. At some point, you'd have to paint the property, maybe a boiler or a dishwasher or a washing machine breaks down. If it's not the tenant's fault, then you'd have to replace it. The same thing applies for fixtures and furniture. It's good to actually put some money aside for that as well. We're always taking about 2% of the rental price to make sure that at some point you can buy new furniture. And you'll have property taxes. This is the tax that you have to pay as the owner. The taxes that are linked to the municipality, links like water, environmental, sewage, garbage tax, are to be paid by the tenant. The property tax is your responsibility. And then you have a total monthly profit of about 170 euros and 50 cents if you deduct all the costs from the rental price. What is good to know is that if you use an agency that charges 80% like we do, then the rental price is, the break-even moment is after, I think it's more about 6 to 7 months, depending, of course, how much the different costs are. If it's higher, the VVE fees, or your mortgage is higher, then it might be 8.5 months. What that means is that if you look at the yield, it's about 3.2%. What we're not doing is taking into account the actual money that you're paying off for your mortgage. So it's good to have a look at that as well. So the yield technically is a little bit higher because you'll have a tenant actually paying for your mortgage. Of course, this really depends on what kind of interest rate you have and what type of mortgage you have, what the actual yield is going to be. If you want to have a session about that, or you have any specific questions, please do reach out to us because we're happy to support with that. Okay, now you've decided to rent out your property. What is good to know though is that as long as you have a mortgage on the property, you officially need permission from your bank or from your mortgage advisor, mortgage provider. What's good to know is that the bank or mortgage provider technically still owns the property until you've paid off the full mortgage. Until then, you have to ask permission. The majority of the banks are okay to give you permission if you're renting out for a short term. Let's say you go away for an assignment to another country for a year or 2 years, then a lot of the providers will say, okay, that is fine, but what is good to know is that you have to use a specific rental contract, one rental contract where the tenant doesn't build up any tenant rights. We'll get into the rental contracts in a few. If the bank doesn't give you permission, which can also be the case for short-term rentals, so if you're renting out for a year or 2 years, not all mortgage providers or banks will give you the go-ahead. But if you're planning on renting out for a longer term, then the bank will most likely say no, unless you change your mortgage to a buy-to-let mortgage. Okay, let's first start with if you want to rent with a resident mortgage. What is good to know is that there's no tax benefits if you rent with a resident mortgage, because the tax benefits or the interest deduction scheme from the Dutch government only applies if you actually live and are registered in the property. So if we go back to the slide here, the mortgage fees or the mortgage costs, we take them as gross because the net is only applicable if you live in the property. The gross is the amount you actually have to deduct from your rental income. Okay, the other thing is that you're only allowed to rent out your property, like I mentioned before, if you do it on a short-term basis with a specific temporary rental contract. Now, if the bank says no, and you have to actually rent your property out, but you have to get a buy-to-let mortgage, take the following things into account. Interest rates are higher for buy-to-let mortgages. They're about 3 to 5% depending on which mortgage provider you go. The other thing is that the value of your property decreases because banks and appraisers and also people look different at properties that are rented, because tenants build up strong tenants' rights here in the Netherlands, which means that if you give them a specific contract that is for an indefinite term, it's very difficult to get them out. The second thing is that as a landlord, if you would live in the property, you'd probably maintain the property better than if a tenant would. Because in the end, what has to be fixed depends a little bit on you as a landlord. And when you live in it, you probably might experience a little more inconvenience of the things that are not working. Whereas if a tenant is living in there, it might be a little bit different. What that means is that technically the value of your property decreases by 10% compared to a residence valuation. Why are we saying this? Because the following is the case. The bank will only grant you a buy-to-let mortgage of about 65 to 70% of the value of the property in a rented condition. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have a property that's 400,000 euros. Okay, that's the valuation when you were living in it. That's the residence valuation. If you plan on renting it out, then suddenly that valuation drops by about 10%. So it's only worth 360,000 euros. Okay, now the bank will only grant you a mortgage of 65 to 70% of that 360,000 euros. Where does the rest of the money come from? Well, either you have to put it up in deposit, or what is good to know is that the bank always looks at loan to value. So if the value of the property that you own has increased since, for example, you've moved in, then it might be that the property is worth 440,000 euros. So that's interesting because then suddenly the value has increased, and then, well, you have to deduct 40,000 euros of that because it decreases about 10% due to it being a property that's rented out. And the bank will suddenly grant you a mortgage of 65 to 70% of that 400,000 euros. Okay, this is important because let's say you've lived in your property for 4, 5, 10 years and you've paid off quite a lot of your mortgage, then suddenly that loan to value might be very interesting for you. And the 30% that you'd have to pay in a deposit would not be applicable because the loan to value is already that attractive for the bank. Okay, the good thing though is, or the other thing though, is that you have to take into account the different interest rates, and that can have an impact on the actual return on investment. This is something I have to say, it is officially necessary to get permission from your bank or your mortgage provider. But from experience, we see that a lot of real estate owners, landlords, don't do that. This is something that is a risk, of course, but the banks don't always proactively research for people that are renting out their properties. As long as you pay your mortgage, they probably won't go after you, but it's still a risk. So it's good to take that into account. Perfect. Okay, so you've decided to rent out your property, you've got permission from your bank, or you don't have permission from your bank, or you've got a buy-to-let mortgage. Now, what is important when you rent out your property in terms of rental contracts? The rental contracts that are in place in the Netherlands are 3 types of rental contracts. The first one is a Model A rental contract. We call that an indefinite contract because the rental period is for as long as the tenant wants. What is good to know, though, is that as a landlord, you can say, okay, I want to have a minimum term that the tenant has to stay. Because some tenants, they love living in a property, but after a year, they might decide to settle down and buy something. They might move back, or maybe even within that period of time. So if you want to have a guaranteed tenant for a specific period of time, you can actually define that in the Model A contract. We experienced that the majority of the landlords request 12 months, some in a very specific occasion request 24 months, but the longer the minimum term is, the less flexible the tenant will be, which might make it less appealing. Okay, what's good to know about the indefinite contract or the Model A contract is that the tenant builds up tenancy rights from the start. What that means is that it's very difficult to evict the tenant. They build up tenant rights, they have the right to stay in the property, and only in severe cases would you be able to annul or cancel the rental contract. Throughout the Model A rental contract, the tenant has the right to give notice of 1 calendar month. If, however, you have a minimum term in place, then the tenant cannot give notice in that minimum term. Sometimes the tenant will request a diplomatic clause that states that they can in specific conditions, but that is not always the case. Plus, it's not mandatory to have that in. You can decide whether you would like to have that in or not. Okay, the indefinite contract, Model A contract, cannot be easily terminated from your end. So that is good to keep in mind. If you are planning to rent out your property for a longer period of time, then it might be interesting to go for a Model A contract because you might have less turnover and you have a guaranteed fixed amount. It also creates a level of trust between you and the tenant, which might be beneficial for having them stay a little bit longer. The Model B contract is a relatively new contract. In 2016, that was introduced. And what that means technically is that you have a temporary contract or agreement with the tenant. The contract is between 12 to 24 months. And what is good to know is that the contract ends at the end of that term. You do have to give notice. That's very important. If you forget to give notice at the end of that term, then the contract will run over into an indefinite contract, and then it becomes a Model A contract. So don't forget to give notice. Throughout this period, though, the tenant has the right to give 1 month's notice. Unlike Model A contract, where you can say there's a minimum term, you cannot do that with a Model B contract. What is good, though, is that the tenant does not build up any tenant rights. So at the end of the contract, when you've given notice in time, the tenant has to leave the contract or less to leave the property. If you decide, however, to rent out the property any further to that tenant, then you can still say, okay, hey, we'd like to extend the contract in agreement with the tenant. It, however, becomes a Model A contract, and you cannot extend a Model B contract for another temporary term. Then that's the Model B contract. The last type of contract is the Model C contract. That is a contract, we also like to call it a diplomatic contract, that is for people who are going on an assignment for a year or 2 years. What happens? You have a temporary term, so 12 to 24 months, and you have the option to extend this contract, this temporary contract, with a similar period. This, however, must be proven. You have to prove why you use a Model C contract. You can't just say, I'm moving in with my partner, or I've bought a new house in the city and I would like the Model C contract. The tenant in this period of time cannot build up any tenant rights. So still at the end of the contract, the tenant has to leave. The contract ends after the rental period. It's again super important to give notice. Don't forget that. As a landlord, you can give notice no sooner than 3 months, no later than 1 month. One other thing that I forgot to mention on this slide for a Model C contract is that you can actually request the tenant to stay for a minimum period of time. So these are the 3 different types of contracts, and decide what kind of contract you would like to offer before you actually promote your property. It's also good to first maybe start with a Model B contract, and if you feel confident about the tenant, you can actually extend it, becomes a Model A. If you're already very confident about your situation, you've rented out your property before, or you want somebody to stay for a longer period of time, you can decide to go with a Model A. The last one, if you decide to leave the country for a year, and maybe your assignment, your own assignment is extended for another year, then you might want to go for the Model C contract. Then, okay, so you've decided to rent out your property, you know what your rental contract will be, then it's always good to do a proper tenant check, because knowing who you'll actually have in your property is super important. These are a couple of things that we do from Relo. We, of course, request an employer statement. Sometimes you can also request an employment contract, but the employer statement has to have HR involved. So they have to request it from somewhere. It also shows extra information, and it's much easier to acquire, and it's still relevant as well. Sometimes if you have a rent or employment contract, it could be a year old almost. So this is the most relevant version that we request. If they're new to the country, then you can actually ask for an employment contract. The passport or an ID, this is an obvious one. We always request a description of the tenant. And of course, if you've done viewings, or if we've done viewings, we kind of like know what type of tenant it kind of is. Then there's a few things which are optional. Like if you are not super sure about somebody's employment contract or somebody's story, you can request payslips. You can always do a reference check. So call the HR of the employer, find out if that person actually works there, and make sure that the employer statement or the employment contract is valid. If the tenant is self-employed, you can request bank account statements or invoices from maybe the last few months to see that they have recurring income. That's super important, because you want to make sure that somebody's actually able to pay your rent for the future, for the next period of time. Okay, that was very, very, very high level. That was actually quicker than I expected. That was actually a 12-minute presentation or a 17-minute presentation. Time for Q&A. I think we're not with a very big group of people. So that means that fire away, go and ask your questions. I'm happy to answer all of them. Let me see what we have. I think I have to stop sharing to actually access the. Are the rental contracts specific to Amsterdam or apply to the whole of the Netherlands? That's a good question from P. Grange. This applies to the whole of the Netherlands. So this is Dutch rental law, and they apply for everywhere, all the cities in the Netherlands, whether it's Amsterdam, Eindhoven, Rotterdam, or any small or major cities. Ismail Adahan, thanks for your question and thanks for your presentation. Is there any permit necessary from the municipality of Amsterdam for renting out an apartment as a Model B, for example? So technically, you do not need a permit from the municipality to rent out your property. What is, however, good to know is that when you rent out your property to more than 3 people or 3 or more people, you need a permit, because the municipality wants to make sure that the level or the quality of living in your neighborhood is actually maintained, and they don't want all the properties to be turned into small student houses. So you would have to need a permit for that. The permit consists of actually insulating your property and making sure that people have enough space in the common areas, and then you would actually be able to request the permit. Think again if you actually consider that, because once you do that, the state of your property will change a little bit, and that might affect the valuation. I hope that answers your question. Nibs, you have a question. Model B, the temporary contract, can be for 6 months. Yes, as well. Technically, we have 3 types of rental situation in the Netherlands. One is holiday rental. That's in Amsterdam now up to 30 days and not allowed in all the neighborhoods. Then you have short stay, which is anywhere from 5 days to 6 months. You, however, need a permit for that. And then you have the long-term rental. That's a minimum of 6 months. So technically, you could actually apply for both a Model A, Model B, and Model C contract with a minimum of 6 months. It's more average to go for a minimum of 12 months or a 12-month contract, because a lot of the tenants they're looking for something with at least some kind of security, and 6 months is relatively low. I hope that answers your question. Leon, so if I go for a Model B or a Model C contract, would my mortgage provider still lower the value of my house and lend me up to 70% of the value? This depends per mortgage provider, and also depends on what your plan is. If you have a good story, let's say you say that you're going away because you have an assignment for work for a year in another country, then you have grounds to actually rent out the property. And if you go to your mortgage provider or your bank, they might actually grant your request. Some banks will grant it and say, for this period of time, you're paying more interest. Some banks will say, this is fine, just go with a temporary contract or a Model C contract. Double, triple, quadruple check it though, to make sure that you can actually move back in at the end. But some banks will also say, no, we have a strict policy. It is not allowed. You'd actually have to go for a buy-to-let mortgage, because the risks involved are, let's say you rent out your property for that period of time and you forget to give notice, then suddenly the tenant builds up tenancy rights. So not all mortgage providers or banks are very keen on doing that. Some others are better prepared and more keen for that as well. What we've seen in the last couple of years is that buy-to-let mortgages have become increasingly more popular. Banks are offering them more often. What that means is that the banks are more aware of the fact that it's lucrative and interesting to actually rent out your property. And I think that as long as you adhere to their rules and make sure that you have the right type of contract and give notice on time, they won't see an issue in it. But again, this depends per mortgage provider. Any more questions? I hope that answered your question, Leon. Yes, from an anonymous attendee. How about tax on rental income? So if you have a property and it's kind of like your main property and you've not invested in it, so you're actually doing the rental yourself, then technically you don't pay any income tax over it. So once it becomes a proper investment, then it's something else. But it's very difficult. So we have several different boxes in the Netherlands, tax boxes, and it's quite difficult to move your property into a tax box which applies the the tax income on your rental income. Nibs, what is the insulation rules for room rentals in Amsterdam? So if you rent out one room, then it's not necessary to get a permit or to insulate the room properly. If you rent it out to multiple people, so more than 3, then you do have to insulate the property properly. What the exact rules are for the insulation depends on the type of property, where it is. Like if you live in the city center, you have an older building, then you have to adhere to certain decibels that can come out. So it's good to look that up. I don't know by heart what the exact rules for insulation are, but I'm happy to look that up for you and share that information with you. Just send us an email and we're happy to share. Is it for the insulation between rooms or is it the insulation between apartments? So technically it's the insulation between rooms. So people have kind of like their own space and they don't get any nuisance from their neighboring students or their neighboring tenants. Of course, the insulation between the properties is also important, because you don't want to have a property that you rent out to 4 people and then the neighbors on either side, upstairs or downstairs, will be bothered by them through the noise. So that is good to look into. We're happy to share. Again, just send me an email. I'll share the documents or the information in a few. Any more questions? Things you would like to know? Oh, there's a few questions in the chat as well. Let me go to the chat. Can you give another Model B to a renter after the first has finished? No. So the Model B, if it's for the same tenant, you cannot extend it into another Model B. But what you can do is give one tenant a Model B, and then if that tenant leaves, you can give another tenant a Model B. So it's only linked to the person that is in your property. You cannot extend it for that same person twice, but you can give a new tenant a Model B contract. So I hope that answers your question. David, what are the ways to end a Type A contract if decision after several years to not rent further? So yes, if you have a Type of A contract, so the indefinite contract, then the only way to actually end the contract is if the tenant breaks the actual agreement within the contract. So sometimes, for example, if a tenant decides to rent it out through Airbnb, that is cause to actually end the property. If you have a good claim to the property, because let's say your own house is burned down and you needed to move in, then you would need you'd be able to actually get the property back. But you have to go to court to annul the contract. Sometimes there might be costs involved because you'd have to find a replacement property for the tenant, and sometimes you'd have to actually pay them off to actually get the property back. So really consider well before you enter a type A contract. Make sure you get the right tenant. So that is the case. The last actual situation is if let's say lightning hits the building and it needs proper renovation, so it's unlivable for a tenant to live in, then of course you can annul the contract as well. But again, you have a responsibility because the tenant built up tenants' rights. So you have a responsibility to find a replacement accommodation that is similar to this property. So the tenant can actually say no to a replacement accommodation. Of course, it has to be reasonable. And again, sometimes you might have to pay them off. So a question from GR, once a Model B has finished, can you give another Model B? Oh, I think that was asked before. What type of service should you expect from a makelaar who's handling all the rental agreements? Okay, I could have actually put a slide of that in the presentation. So what a makelaar normally does is they come into the property, they do a rent estimate, they take photos of the property, they promote it, list it, share it with the network, and then they accept the viewings. What they'll also do is they'll set up the rental contracts, but first they'll actually introduce the candidates to you, and they'll set up the rental contract. They'll actually draft it. What is good to know is that there are template rental contracts set up by the rental association. So most of them use template contracts that you can actually edit based on the input from the tenant, from you, and so on. What they'll do is they'll actually make sure that it's signed, that the deposit and rent is in the bank account on time. Please note it has to happen before the first day of the rental period. And then they'll do the check-in, which is kind of like the handover. They'll give the keys and they'll set up a check-in report. They'll document the condition of the property once the tenant moves in. And that is important because at the end of the tenancy term, you'll have to use that document again to say, okay, hey, this is what it looked like when you moved in. This is what it looked like when you moved out. So I'm going to either deduct some of the deposit or you're going to get the full deposit amount back. This is what the majority of them manage. This is the service that they offer. The average of the market charge is 1 month of rent plus VAT. At Reload, we charge 80% because we're a little bit more digitally driven. So we have streamlined and more efficient process. So it doesn't take us as long. Plus we have a big network of corporates behind us and agents and tenants as well. So it makes it a little bit easier for us to find properties. Any more questions? Okay. I think there's a question from Nibs. If there is a rental in which the house owner also lives, doesn't income tax need to be paid on rent? So if you live with I think that you're living in the same property and you're renting it out, the same thing applies. It's very difficult to move your property into box 3, which means that most of the people will actually not have to pay tax over their rental income. Anonymous attendee, and if I want to sell a property with a type contract? So that's a good question. Again, the valuation of your property will be less. So people look at rental properties differently as they look at properties that are free of any tenants, because the majority of the people that will buy rental properties are investors. So the market is smaller and the property might be less maintained. It's not as easy to define what the quality of the condition or the condition of the property is because the owner has not lived in it. So you can still sell it, but the valuation will be lower. Take on average about 10% of the property value compared to a residence permit or a residence property. Hope that answers your question. Leon, do I need to get VVE's green light before renting out my property? That depends on the VVE. It's a good question. Some VVEs will say, okay, we're happy for people to rent it out. Some VVEs will say, we need to give official permission. And some VVEs will just say no. Have a look at your bylaws, your house rules. The majority of the smaller VVEs and even some of the big flats don't mind. But please do take that into account that they do have a veto to say, okay, hey, this is not what we want. The same thing applies for the other type of rentals. Okay, then another question from David. What happens to a rental contract if the house is sold by the owner? Does it transfer to the next owner? Yes, it does. I think that's the easiest. It does. The rental contract will state that once a new owner becomes owner, that the rental contract will still be in place. Those are the tenant rights that a tenant does have. The only reason why a tenant could get evicted is if the bank finds out that you're renting the property without permission, and they say, okay, hey, you have to either sell the property and we'll evict the tenant, or we'll evict the tenant, so you have to move back in. Another question from Leon. How do I make sure I'm giving a model B or C contract instead of an A contract? So it has to be clearly defined in the contract what type of contract it is. It won't be stated as this is a model C contract. It will be stated as this is a contract that is specifically for a temporary period of time and will end at the end of that time. Other contracts will state this is a contract that is for an indefinite term and will not end. So it has to be clearly stated in the contract. A question from Pre-Grunge. If you rent out a room in your house you own to a housemate, do they build up tenancy rights? That's a good question. So if it's just to a housemate and he pays cash, no, there has to be a tenancy agreement in place, or he has to be able to prove that he's renting from you. If it's a room rent and you still own the property and you live in it, they don't build up the tenant rights. Again, the model contracts do apply. So if he's living there for an indefinite period of time, there's a different rule for that. So they do build up tenant rights at some point, but I would just work on the temporary contract terms. Otherwise, yeah, there's another thing that if you rent the property, or if you define the tenant that's living in your property not as a tenant but as an occupant, then they build up different rights and they don't build up the same tenant rights and cannot stay forever. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions? No, let me share my screen again. Cool. So we offer a free rental valuation. I'll share this presentation with you. There's going to be a link here, or go to reload.nl. And if you just want to touch base with us, we're happy to share information and answer any questions that you have. This is our phone number. This is the web or the email that you can actually reach us. My name is Kimo. I don't think there's any more questions. Let me stop sharing for one more time. No, that was all the questions there was. So thanks a lot, guys and girls and ladies. So hope you have a lovely evening. Again, we'll share the presentation with you and the webinar. So no need to write anything down. You're welcome. Thanks, Leon. Thanks for having you. You too, Plegrange. Thanks, UGR. Thanks, David. Great to have you all. Take care and have a lovely Wednesday evening. Bye-bye.